For joining us. Hello again, everyone, and good afternoon. Thank you so much for joining us today, and we want to welcome you to the fiscal year 2023-2024 funding plan for Clean Transportation Incentives Work Group, where we'll be going over an update to the funding plan process. My name is Diane Sanchez, and I'm the lead outreach staff over the funding plan this year. I'm joined today by our team of staff who are helping lead and support the development of this year's funding plan. So I'll have some of them briefly introduce themselves.
Hi, my name is Stephanie Parent, and I'm the strategy lead over the funding plan this year.
Hi, I'm Jason Crow. I oversee the funding plan, and I'm also the manager of the off-road and the agricultural strategies and incentives section.
Thank you, Jason and Stephanie, for those intros. There are many more staff members that make up this team, and you will get to know them once we kick off the funding plan development process. Now, before we get started, I did want to go over some logistics for today's discussion. As a reminder, this meeting is being recorded. We anticipate a copy of this recording will be made available on the Low Carbon Transportation Incentives Air Quality Improvement Program Meetings and Workshops webpage in no more than 2 weeks. And the list of attendees will be posted along with the recording. All the materials for today's workshop, including the agenda and the slides, are all available on the same webpage, and a link to these materials will be dropped in the Zoom chat. We will be leveraging Zoom's raised hand features to facilitate comments and questions. If there are Zoom disruptions for any reason, including malicious intent, we'll immediately end today's meeting and send out another notice to reschedule. And lastly, we're unable to allow anonymous meeting participants for security reasons. So please make sure that your name is clear on the Zoom platform. And if you've called in, we'll make sure to adjust your phone number and call on you if you raise your hand based on the last 4 digits of your phone number. All right, next slide, please. Now let's review our agenda. For today's work group, we will begin with discussing the purpose of the new process for Clean Transportation Incentives Funding Plan. Then we'll explain the key changes that have been made to the funding plan process for this fiscal year 2023-2024. After we cover those key changes, we'll open it up for our attendees to ask questions related to those changes. So please keep in mind that this work group today is intended to introduce the changes to the funding plan process itself and not specific incentive programs, policies, or budget changes. As we'll explain in the upcoming slides, the funding plan development process will kick off in the summer, and that's when we'll begin discussing specific programs, policies, and taking feedback on potential improvements to those. After, we will have an open discussion, and then with the attendees, we'll have them we'll take your comments, we'll answer your questions, and then we'll wrap up our work group with a summary and go over our next steps. All right, so let's start with an overview of the funding plan and talk about this new process. So to achieve its numerous climate change, air quality, zero emission vehicle deployment, and petroleum reduction goals, the state has adopted an aggressive and multi-pronged strategy that uses incentives to complement regulatory approaches. Additionally, incentives play a pivotal role in accelerating the transition of fleets to zero emission in line with Governor Newsom's Executive Order N7920. Each incentive program has its own distinct goals that support the state's broader strategy. And it's important to maintain the integrity of each program's goals to ensure that the state achieves both immediate air quality benefits and that it supports the innovative technologies necessary to meet the state's vision of a zero-emission economy. Additionally, outside of CARB, other federal, state, and local agencies have complementary funding sources as well. Examples of those would include the California Energy Commission's Clean Transportation Program and the Strategic Growth Council's community-based projects. And we coordinate with our sister agencies on these investment programs pretty regularly. Next slide. The funding plan for clean transportation incentives serves as the annual blueprint for expending the clean transportation incentive funds that are appropriated to CARB in the state budget. The funding plan establishes CARB's priorities for the funding cycle, describes the projects that CARB intends to fund, and sets funding targets and outreach strategies for each project. Each year, the funding plan is updated and includes funding proposals and implementation details specific to each fiscal year. The funding plan process has been adapted over the years to accommodate new funding sources, more projects, and significant increases in funding. The funding plan calendar has also grown from a few months of development to almost an entire year. So this has caused overlap and confusion with routine project implementation. So over time, the funding plan has slowly grown from 30 pages with no appendices in 2012 to 170 pages with 10 appendices just last year. The funding plan development process includes robust outreach, community engagement, and involvement of other participants such as the state administrators, local state agencies, and non-governmental organizations. And the feedback that we have heard from these involved parties has included the funding plan is too big of a document. The massive amount of information in the plan is too much for interested parties, including the CARB board, to easily digest. The funding plan is confusing. A streamlined and more simple approach for interested parties to provide input to the plan is really needed. It's important to have information on the projects in the funding plan available and easy to access all year, not just within the funding plan document. And the overlap between the funding plan development and routine project implementation causes confusion. So in order to address these concerns that we've heard, we've developed 4 key changes to the funding plan process for fiscal year 2023-24. And these changes include a shortened timeline for funding plan development, a streamlined public process, strategic content within the funding plan document, and finally, leveraging more streamlined and expanded CARB web pages to host project and program content. Let's dive into the details of these changes. All right, so the first change we'll discuss is our shortened timeline for the funding plan. In recent years, due to the extended budget process for CARB funding, previous funding plan development timelines would take up almost an entire year. However, our new timeline will be cut in half from June through November, and this will allow staff to kick off the funding plan process with more concrete budget numbers. And additionally, to account for the shortened timeline and reduce participant fatigue, public work groups are going to be consolidated and combined under similar topics and themes. And this slide shows our new timeline and key milestones. So we'll kick off the funding plan development process in June with our first workshop. Then between June and September, we'll hold daytime public work group meetings, as well as separate evening community work groups that will be held every 3rd Tuesday of the month for community members. A draft plan will be released in late August, at least 10 days ahead of the second funding plan workshop. Then the funding plan will be finalized in September, posted in October for the 30-day public review. And finally, we hope to go to board in November. Now, the second change, which I alluded to in the last slide, is a streamlined public process. We'll continue to have project-specific implementation work groups all year as usual, and this will allow staff to focus on implementation efforts in the first half of the year and coordinate timing with funding plan meetings during the second half of the year to avoid overlap and minimize confusion. Daytime public meetings on the funding plan development will be consolidated under similar topics and themes to decrease the potential for participant fatigue and be a more effective use of staff and the public's time. So for example, staff may aim to hold a work group on all of the light duty purchase incentive projects together, focusing that meeting on potential changes to the full suite of projects instead of meeting on each project separately. Additionally, this consolidation may provide opportunities to collaborate across other incentives or regulatory conversations. The evening community meetings will give community members an accessible way to engage with staff, and the topics covered during these evening work groups will mirror those daytime meetings. Now, our funding strategy lead, Stephanie Parent, is spearheading the changes to the funding plan document this year. So I'd like to invite her up to tell you about the changes that you can expect to see.
Apologies for that. Thanks, Diane, and hello again, everyone. So the third change to the funding plan process is strategic document content. So in other words, it's going to be a much smaller funding plan, and the goal is to have a streamlined document that is easier for everyone to navigate. Certain elements will not change, but they may be shortened. Some examples as the executive summary, the introduction, and the background. The foundational information that does not change will be moved to a streamlined CARB webpage. Some reports will also be placed online and referenced in the funding plan. Project chapters should include proposed allocations, necessary projections, proposed changes, impacts of the changes, and necessary reporting requirements from the audit.
Awesome. Thank you, Stephanie. So now the final change that you will see in the fiscal year 2023-24 funding plan process will be an overhaul of our CARB webpage resources for a more streamlined and expanded offering of program information online. So these web pages will have two target audiences. One is the community members and the legislature who will benefit from overview, landing, and summary pages. And two will be individuals, businesses, legislatures, and researchers who will benefit from project pages. So the overview and landing pages will include foundational, legislative, and budgetary information. They'll describe the goals of the project categories and how projects complement each other. The pages will also draw connections to other programs and categories across CARB and other entities. So for example, the California Energy Commission. We also hope to include statistics on the investments made, demographics, and testimonials. Now the project pages will include project goals, the current status of the project, and important statistics. We'll also include foundational background information such as legislative or budgetary direction. And finally, we'll include links to the actual program pages. So we hope that in streamlining our web pages, we'll be able to consolidate old web pages to eliminate duplication. And additionally, we'll be leveraging CARB's events calendar so that we can eliminate the standalone LCTI meetings and events page. And finally, by moving that background information and program data from the funding plan document to the web page, our hope is that the funding plan itself will be more straightforward, concise, and overall make it easier for our interested parties to provide comments. All right, well, that concludes our process update for the fiscal year 2023-24 funding plan. So I'm now going to pass it to my teammates Stephanie and Bianca so that they can facilitate comments and take questions.
My apologies again, trying to relocate my unmute button. So hi, everyone. If you would like to make a comment or ask a question, please use the webinar feature to raise your hand. If you're using Zoom online, please click the raised hand option on the Zoom navigation bar under the Participants tab. For those using Zoom on a mobile application, please click on the raised hand option in the More tab. And if you're joining us by phone today and you would like to make a comment or ask a question, please be sure to press #2 on your phone and we will be able to call on you accordingly. And just a reminder, oh, it looks like maybe Bianca is changing some phone numbers just to the last 4 digits. But if you're able to do that, you can do that on your end as well. So once your line is open, you will be able to begin speaking. And please state your name and your affiliation first before providing a comment or asking a question. Okay, so I do see we have a question from, and my apologies if I pronounce anyone's name incorrectly, Fabio Lau, and I will unmute your line. And you should be able to speak now.
Yeah, can you hear me?
It's a little soft.
Is that better? Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay, excellent. Hi, my name is Fabi Lau. I'm with the Center for Sustainable Energy. Thank you for providing this update on the, the new public process going forward. We had a question. I forgot what slide it was, but I think Diane was talking about there's going to be focus on the first half of the year and the second half of the year for topics. I was wondering if you can go over that again, because I didn't quite catch what you were talking about.
Yeah, sure.
Thank you.
So I think that was, if we could go back a few slides, Bianca.
I know it's under the Streamlined public process slide, but I don't know I remember the number of the slide.
Yeah, so what we're saying here is that essentially, previously, our funding plan had gone over an entire year, and it was confusing because there were implementation, just like regular implementation project meetings that were overlapping with the funding plan development of, the following year's project and where it was going to go. So what we're saying is that this year, because we're shortening the funding plan development process to the latter half of the year between June and November, that the first half of the year, we would continue to have those project-specific implementation work groups where they're actually working on implementing the projects. And then in the second half of the year, that we would continue with, or begin, I should say, the funding plan development process. And that if there are project-specific work groups, we're going to try and combine them into topics. So the example we gave is, I think, for the clean vehicle purchase incentives. So instead of having multiple different meetings, for example, Clean Cars for All, financing assistance, and all the different incentive programs, we can combine them into a single topic, and then we can listen to the feedback from community members or interested parties on the feedback you might have on policy changes, or we can answer questions about the budget, or where we're going in the direction of those particular programs. Does that answer your question?
Yes, thank you.
Okay.
Okay. The next person with a question is Ashley Garrity, and I have unmuted you, so you can unmute on your end and ask your question or make your comment, please.
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yes.
Great. Okay, I have two questions. First of all, thank you so much for putting this together. It's really helpful to hear about the changes ahead of the process. My first question is, if you could speak a little bit more on actually this slide. I'm just curious about like the difference of what's going to be talked about in the funding plan meetings versus the community meetings, or if there's any difference at all. And then would it be redundant to attend both on the same topic?
Yeah, that's a great question, and thank you for bringing that up. So first, no, there won't be a big difference in what is being talked about. So we actually want the two meetings to mirror each other, the daytime topics versus the evening community meetings. I think the main difference is that the evening community meetings are geared towards community members and maybe small CBOs and those interested parties, rather than maybe the state administrators or our typical partners in government or non-governmental organizations. So we want to accommodate our community members' schedules by hosting those meetings kind of at a regular time, once a month, at the same later hour in the evening. And we would really share the same information, but it would be geared towards getting feedback from the community members. So I would say, I wouldn't necessarily say, or how would I say it? If you're interested in hearing from those community members and hearing what they might have to say, it might be a good idea to attend both or just the evening meetings. But if you prefer to go to the daytime meeting, if you're from a state agency, or if you're from one of those non-governmental organizations or a state administrator, maybe you opt to go to the daytime meeting.
Great, that's super helpful. Thank you. And then my second question is just on how far in advance will the meetings be announced?
Oh, that's a great question. So our schedule is actually already up on our LCTI meetings and events page, which Bianca will be putting in the chat at the end of the meeting, but I think we can put it in now, Bianca, if you don't mind. Or I could do it either way. So the meetings are already scheduled. However, like the links for registration and things like that, those might not be available until maybe a few weeks before the actual meeting happens, if that makes sense.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you.
Yeah, and additionally, so we do have placeholders for those community evening meetings. However, we haven't quite determined in what order the project-specific themed meetings will be coming out. So I think those we don't quite know yet. However, we do have those holds for community meetings and our main workshops for the funding plan development process, like those overall larger workshops. But if you sign up for our listserv or keep in contact with us via email, which again, we'll share later on, then we can keep you up to date on those, on like what topic is going to come up in what month.
All right, thank you so much for your answers.
Yep.
And right now, I am not seeing any other questions. So just a reminder to everyone, if you have a comment or a question, please feel free to raise your hand in Zoom, or if you're joining us by phone, you can press #2 on your phone to raise your hand. Okay, I'm not seeing anything. And so, and I guess if there are no more questions, we could, we can end our session. I would like to thank everyone for your participation and your questions today. And I will hand it back over to Diane to go over summary and next steps.
Sure thing. And if we can go to slide 15, please. And we'll have an opportunity once I go over next steps in case anyone still has any questions. We'll stay on for a bit. So thank you so much, Stephanie and Bianca, for helping facilitate the questions. And so let's start and go over the next steps. All right, so there were some questions about this. So our funding plan development schedule, it is now available on our LCTI meeting and events page. And as we discussed earlier, we're kicking off that process in June with daytime and evening meetings between June and September. So please visit our webpage, which will be linked in the chat if you wish to participate in those. And in a couple weeks, you'll also be able to find this information on CARB's main events calendar with a simple search for funding plan development. And so Bianca will link that LCTI meetings and events page in the chat. And if you can go to the next slide. All right, and so feel free, please, to contact us or follow up with our team with any questions about the funding plan process. So again, my name is Diane Sanchez. I am the outreach lead staff, and Stephanie Parent is our strategy lead staff on the fiscal year 2023-24 funding plan development process. And our manager is Jason Crow. He also has his information listed up here. Additionally, you can also reach us at our team's email, which Bianca will drop in the chat, and that is cleantransportationincentives@arb.ca.gov, and that will be dropped in the chat. So to keep your inboxes up to date on the funding plan process, please subscribe via the listserv, which is on this PowerPoint, but it will also be dropped in the chat. And so we still have plenty of time, so I think we'll stay on for a few minutes here, see if anyone else has any questions before we close it out. Thank you, everyone. Okay, it looks like I'll hand it over to Stephanie to call on raised hands.
Okay, Jerry Roan, I've unmuted you, and please begin.
Okay. You use the term zero emissions vehicles when they're not actually zero emissions. How do you define what California thinks is a zero emissions vehicle?
So from my understanding, there are zero emission vehicles and there are also near zero emission vehicles. So I don't have the exact technical definition of the zero emission vehicles that we typically use, but you are right in that there are also near zero emission vehicles that might use different technology that are not exactly zero emission. However, I'm going to pass it to Jason to see if he has a specific definition on zero emission versus near zero and others.
Sure, thanks, Diane. I'll just add that when we refer to zero emission, we just mean zero tailpipe emission on those vehicles.
Yeah, it's a little bit unfair to the companies that produce a actually zero emission vehicle to call something that's emitting at the power plant when we use solar that doesn't emit anything.
Well, thank you, Jerry, for your comment. We'll definitely take that into consideration. And a quick reminder to participants, if you can also state your affiliation.
I'm with TriTrack Motors.
TriTrack Motors. Thank you, Jerry.
Okay, we have another question here. And Christopher Chavez, I've unmuted your mic. Go ahead and begin.
Yeah, this is Chris Chavez with Coalition for Clean Air. Regarding I know one of the big aspects of the funding plan last year was the statewide expansion for the Clean Cars for All program. And I know that, this isn't the main staff who work on that particular program, but will there be any sort of updates on where the status of that program is anytime soon?
So I think overall, we are planning to kick off all that information when we begin the funding plan process in June. However, we do have staff here from Clean Cars for All if they want to give a quick update if they're not going to begin until June, or if there's going to be anything before that regarding the statewide expansion. So Aaron, if you'd like to quickly answer, that's totally up to you.
Sure. Thanks, Dan. No, I think your answer pretty much covers it. I think there'll be periodic updates on the process of that of the statewide expansion starting in June with the funding plan.
Understood. Thank you.
All right. Thanks, Chris, for your question.
And right now, I'm not seeing any other questions. Just a reminder, if you have a question or a comment, feel free to raise your hand or press #2 on your phone.
Yeah, and we'll, I see some folks.
Okay, Danny Leung, apologies for if I butchered that. Go ahead and begin.
Yeah, thank you. Danny Leung from GNA. And I had a question in regards to any of the budgetary changes in the governor's plan. I know there's some budget cuts to some program that will be leading up to how the funding plan for this year will be developed. Just curious to hear your thoughts on, when's the right opportunity for stakeholders to provide feedback regarding budgetary changes rather than just funding plan implementation?
Okay, yeah, that's a good question. So Danny, are you referring to, when can interested parties kind of comment towards the legislature on, where the budgeting is going, or on the CARB end?
Yeah, more of the legislature.
Okay. I'm going to pass that one to Lisa in case she knows anything about that.
Yeah. Good afternoon, Lisa McCumber. I'm the branch chief over the Equitable Mobility Incentives branch and supporting the funding plan development process. So if you are interested in getting engaged in the legislative process around the state budget, I would encourage you to take a look at both the Senate and the Assembly budget websites. There are subcommittees that hear the budget and discuss what the budget will look like that are taking place right now. So there is an opportunity with the state legislature to get involved. And if you are looking for some guidance there, we can connect you with our legislative office as well, who can help out in that regard. With regard to the budget and what is ultimately decided for CARB, part of why we're pushing this process out to June is to be able to accommodate for that. The budget will likely change quite a bit from what the governor's proposed and what the legislature proposes through their process. And so we're just going to wait till those things settle before we begin our planning process.
Great, thank you.
And if there aren't any other questions, then we could go ahead and wrap up our work group meeting.
Yeah, thank you so much, everyone, again, for joining us and hearing about our changes for the upcoming funding plan process. We really appreciate your time. And again, if you have any questions, please feel free to contact the team. We are here to answer those questions for you. Thank you again, and have a great evening, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.